I was 69 years old when I opened an email from my apartment complex and realized my retirement wasn't going to work anymore. Not someday, right then. My rent was going up to $2,800 a month. I read the number 3 times because I thought there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. I was living outside Tampa, Florida, in a 2-bedroom apartment I'd rented for almost 6 years. When I first moved in, I was paying $1,650. That already felt expensive to me. Then it went to $1,800. Then $2,050. Then $2,300. By the time that email arrived, they wanted almost $500 more every month when I renewed my lease. And I was living on $2,075 a month from Social Security. So you can probably see the problem. My rent alone was going to be more than my entire monthly check. I did have savings, about $74,000 at the time. I wasn't broke, but I also wasn't rich enough to pretend the math didn't matter. If I stayed where I was and kept pulling money out of savings every month, eventually that money was going to disappear. Maybe not next year, maybe not even 5 years from then. But I was 69. I didn't know if I needed that money to last another 10 years or another 25. And that's when I started thinking about something I hadn't seriously considered since I retired: going back to work. I spent most of my career working in medical billing and insurance offices. I didn't hate it. But after more than 30 years of sitting behind a desk, answering phones, fixing billing problems, and arguing with insurance companies, I thought I was done. I'd retired at 67. I remember leaving the office on my last day, carrying a little plant, a coffee mug, and a cardboard box with the few things I kept at my desk. Everybody hugged me. There was cake in the break room. One of the women I worked with said, "You're free now." I really believed that. 2 years later, I was sitting at my kitchen table looking at job listings. Receptionist, medical office assistant, part-time billing clerk, 20 hours a week, 25 hours a week. I even filled out half of an online application. Then I stopped. I remember staring at the screen and thinking, is this really what retirement is going to be? Work until I'm 67, retire for 2 years, then go back because my apartment got too expensive? I closed the laptop, and for the next few days I started looking for another answer. At first, I looked at cheaper places in Florida. There were some, just not as cheap as I expected. Then I looked in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, a few smaller towns in Tennessee. But once I added rent, a car, insurance, utilities, groceries, and everything else, I wasn't seeing the big difference I hoped for. Then one night, probably around midnight, I ended up watching a video about a retired American living in the Philippines. I had never been there. I knew almost nothing about the country. If you had asked me to name 5 cities in the Philippines at that point, I probably couldn't have done it. But this man was showing his apartment. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't some luxury condo overlooking the ocean. It was just a normal little apartment. And he said he was paying less than $400 a month. I thought I heard him wrong. I rewound the video. Then I watched another one. Then another. Cebu, Dumaguete, Iloilo, Manila. One person said he lived on $1,500 a month. Another said $2,000 gave him a very comfortable life. Of course, other people said that was nonsense. Some said you needed $3,000. Some said $1,000 was enough. The more videos I watched, the less certain I became about the actual cost. But one thing was obvious. My $2,075 Social Security check that barely covered rent in Florida could buy a completely different kind of life somewhere else. That idea stayed in my head. For about 2 weeks, I didn't tell anybody. Then one Sunday afternoon, my daughter came over. She was sitting across from me at the kitchen table when I finally said it. I think I'm going to the Philippines. She stopped chewing. Then she laughed. Not because she was making fun of me. She honestly thought I was joking. When she realized I wasn't, her whole face changed. Mom, what are you talking about? I told her I wasn't moving there. Not yet. I wasn't selling everything. I wasn't making some crazy permanent decision after watching a few YouTube videos. I had a much simpler plan. My lease ended in 3 months. Instead of signing another one, I was going to put most of my belongings in storage. I was going to take $10,000 out of my savings, and I was going to give myself 6 months in the Philippines. If I hated it, I'd come home. If it was too difficult, I'd come home. If the numbers people were talking about online were completely wrong, I'd come home. But if I could actually live comfortably on my retirement income without touching my savings every month, I wasn't going back to work. That was the deal I made with myself. 6 months, $10,000, and one question I needed answered. Was retirement actually over for me? Or was I simply trying to retire in the wrong place? My daughter didn't like the plan. That wasn't a surprise. She started asking questions faster than I could answer them. Where was I going to live? Did I know anyone there? What if I got sick? What if I got robbed? What if I needed to come home suddenly? What if the apartment I rented wasn't safe? What if all those people online were exaggerating? The truth was, I didn't know. That was part of what made me nervous. I had traveled before, but never like this. I'd taken vacations to Mexico and the Caribbean. I'd been on a cruise. I'd flown across the country plenty of times. But I had never landed in another country by myself with the idea that I might stay for half a year. My daughter kept saying the same thing. You're 69, Mom. Why would you make your life harder now? And I understood what she meant. But from where I was sitting, staying in Florida wasn't exactly making my life easier. I showed her my numbers. After taxes and deductions, I was getting a little over $2,000 a month. My current rent was already $2,300. Car insurance was $186. Electricity was usually between $140 and $190. My phone was $72. Internet was $65. Then groceries, gas, prescriptions, and everything else. Even before the new rent increase, I was already pulling money out of savings. Some months it was $700. Some months it was $1,000. If something went wrong with the car, it was more. My daughter looked at the page for a while. Then she said something that surprised me. So move closer to me. She lived about an hour away. I had already checked. Apartments near her weren't cheap either. And even if I found something for $1,700 or $1,800, I still needed the car. I still had insurance. I still had all the same bills. It might slow down the problem. It wouldn't solve it. I told her I wasn't asking her to agree with me. I was just asking her to give me 6 months. If it went badly, she could spend the rest of my life reminding me she was right. That finally made her laugh. After that, things started moving quickly. I gave notice on my apartment. That was the moment when the whole thing stopped feeling like an idea. I was actually leaving. I sold my dining table to a young couple for $150. A neighbor bought the television from my bedroom. I donated 3 bags of clothes. I gave my daughter boxes of photo albums, old Christmas decorations, and a few things that had belonged to my mother. Everything else went into a small storage unit. I kept my car at first. My daughter agreed to keep it at her house while I was gone. That cost me a little money every month, but I wasn't ready to get rid of it. I wanted an escape route. If I came back after 6 months and decided the Philippines had been a terrible idea, I didn't want to land in Florida with no apartment, no furniture, and no car. I booked a furnished apartment in Cebu City for my first month. The rent was just under $700. That was more than some of the places I'd seen online, but I wanted something simple when I arrived. Air conditioning, a washing machine, a building with security, a grocery store nearby. I figured I could look for something cheaper once I understood the city. I bought travel insurance. I scheduled a doctor's appointment. I made copies of my prescriptions. I bought 2 large suitcases. Then I made a spreadsheet. I gave myself a 6-month budget of $10,000, not including the airfare. That worked out to about $1,666 a month. My Social Security was a little higher than that, so if the experiment worked, I should technically be able to live there without touching my savings at all, at least on paper. But I didn't fully believe it. My first flight went from Tampa to Los Angeles, then Los Angeles to Manila, then Manila to Cebu. By the time I reached Cebu, I had been traveling for more than a day. I was exhausted. My hair looked terrible. My feet were swollen. And I had reached the point where I didn't care what anything cost as long as somebody got me to a bed. The first thing that hit me when I walked outside the airport wasn't fear. It was the heat. It felt like somebody had opened an oven. Within about 30 seconds, I was sweating. Then came the noise. Cars, vans, people talking, drivers calling out. I was standing there with 2 giant suitcases, trying to figure out where I was supposed to go, when I suddenly had this awful thought. What did I just do? I had been so focused on rent prices and retirement numbers that I hadn't really pictured this part. I was thousands of miles from my daughter. I didn't know the city. I didn't know the language. I didn't know anybody. And now there was no apartment back home waiting for me. For the first time since I made the decision, I wanted to undo it. I got into the car that was taking me to my apartment and barely spoke. I just stared out the window. Cebu wasn't what I expected. There were huge modern buildings and shopping centers. Then a few minutes later, we'd pass crowded streets packed with little shops, motorcycles, wires, signs, and people everywhere. I couldn't make sense of it yet. When we finally reached my building, the guard helped me with my suitcases. I got upstairs, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. I remember thinking, just get through tonight. Don't decide anything tonight. That first evening, I didn't explore. I didn't go looking for Filipino food. I didn't walk around the neighborhood. I ordered a cheeseburger and fries through an app the building receptionist helped me install. Then I called my daughter. The first thing she asked was, "Do you hate it?" I looked around my little apartment and I told her the truth. I don't know yet. The next morning, I woke up at 4:20, jet lag. I made coffee and sat by the window watching the city slowly get brighter. And once the sun came up, something changed. I wasn't as scared. I was curious. So I got dressed, put some cash in my purse, and walked outside. That morning was when my 6-month experiment actually began. The first place I walked into was a small bakery. I had no idea what half the things in the display case were, so I pointed at 2 rolls and a pastry that looked familiar. The woman behind the counter smiled and told me the total. I thought I misunderstood her. It came to less than $2. I walked outside with my little paper bag and started laughing. Not because $2 breakfast was going to save my retirement, but it was the first moment when the numbers I'd seen online started to feel real. Over the next few days, I did something I probably should have done before I moved there. I started keeping track of everything I spent: coffee, meals, laundry, transportation, groceries, even little things like bottled water. I wanted to know what normal life actually cost, not what somebody on YouTube claimed it cost. My first surprise was groceries. Some things were cheap: fresh fruit, rice, eggs, vegetables, local bread. Other things weren't. Imported cheese was expensive. The cereal I used to buy in Florida cost more than I expected. A jar of peanut butter I recognized was almost the same price as back home. And I made one mistake immediately. I tried to shop exactly the way I had in America. That first grocery trip cost much more than I expected. When I got back to the apartment, I spread everything out on the counter and looked at the receipt. I had spent almost $90. That wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what I imagined after hearing people say how cheap everything was. So I started paying attention to what local people were buying. I tried different brands. I bought more fresh food. I stopped filling my cart with things simply because the packaging looked familiar. My grocery bill dropped fast. Transportation took a little longer. At first, I used Grab almost everywhere. It was easy. I could see the price before I got in. I didn't have to explain where I was going. And compared with taxis back in Florida, it seemed cheap. But after 2 weeks, all those little rides started adding up. So I tried a jeepney. I wish somebody had filmed my first attempt. I stood on the side of the road watching people get on and off like everybody had been given instructions except me. Finally, a young woman noticed I was completely lost. She asked where I was going and told me which one to take. Then she actually waited with me. The ride cost almost nothing. It was crowded. It was hot. I nearly missed my stop. But when I climbed out, I felt strangely proud of myself. I was learning. Not quickly, but I was learning. By the end of my first month, I had spent just over $1,900. That bothered me. My target was around $1,666. I had told myself I needed to prove I could live on my Social Security. Instead, I was already over budget. But when I looked closer, the numbers weren't as bad as they seemed. The biggest expense was the apartment, almost $700. Then there were things I wouldn't pay every month: travel insurance, a few household items, extra transportation because I didn't know where anything was, and way too many restaurant meals during my first 2 weeks. I realized the real test would start in month 2, so I began looking for another apartment. That's when I discovered something else. The cheapest places online weren't always places I wanted to live. I visited one apartment that looked great in the photos. In person, the room was dark, the bathroom smelled damp, and the window faced a concrete wall. It was about $280 a month. I lasted 5 minutes before I thanked the landlord and left. Another place was cheaper than my Cebu apartment, but it was far enough away that I knew I'd spend more money getting around. Then I found a small 1-bedroom unit in a quieter area. Nothing fancy. A bedroom, a little kitchen, a small living area, air conditioning in the bedroom. The building wasn't new, but it was clean. Rent was about $430 a month. That was the first number that really got my attention. I kept thinking about my apartment in Florida. $2,800. Then I looked around this little place. $430. I knew it wasn't a fair comparison. The apartments weren't the same size. The neighborhoods weren't the same. The countries weren't the same. But I didn't need them to be the same. I needed somewhere safe and comfortable that I could actually afford. I moved in at the beginning of my second month, and that's when something unexpected happened. My expenses dropped. A lot. By the end of that month, I had spent around $1,420. Rent, electricity, internet, food, transportation, everything. For the first time since retiring, I had money left over from my Social Security check. I called my daughter that evening. She expected me to tell her I was ready to come home. Instead, I said, "I think this might actually work." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she asked me a question I hadn't really thought about. "Okay, but are you happy there?" And that was harder to answer, because saving money and building a life were turning out to be two completely different things. That question stayed with me. Was I happy? I wasn't unhappy. That was the strange part. I wasn't sitting in my apartment crying or counting the days until I could leave. But I also wasn't waking up excited every morning. Most days were simple. I'd make coffee, walk to the grocery store, pick up lunch somewhere, come home, watch television, call my daughter, maybe take a grab somewhere if I felt restless. Then do almost the same thing the next day. Back in Florida, I had complained about how expensive everything was. But I had routines there. I had neighbors I knew. I had a friend named Carol who I'd meet for lunch every few weeks. My daughter was an hour away. I knew which doctor to call. I knew which store had the coffee I liked. I knew how everything worked. In Cebu, I was saving money, but I was spending a lot of time alone. That started bothering me during my third month. I remember one Saturday evening especially. I could hear people outside, cars, music somewhere nearby, people laughing. And I was sitting on my couch, eating crackers and cheese while watching an old crime show. I thought, I didn't move halfway around the world to sit inside watching the same television shows I watched in Florida. So the next morning, I made myself leave the apartment without a plan. I walked farther than usual and ended up at a small cafe. There were only a few tables inside. I ordered coffee and breakfast and sat near the window. A woman at the next table smiled at me. She was probably around my age. After a few minutes, she asked if I was visiting. I told her I was trying Cebu for 6 months. She laughed and said, "Only 6 months?" Her name was Lorna. She had spent years working overseas and had recently returned to Cebu. We ended up talking for almost an hour. Before I left, she invited me to join her and 2 friends for lunch later that week. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to go, because I was nervous. That sounds ridiculous at 69 years old. But when you've spent weeks mostly by yourself, walking into a group where everyone already knows each other can feel uncomfortable. I went anyway. That lunch lasted almost 3 hours. We talked about families, retirement, food, the cost of living. One of the women wanted to know why an American woman my age had come to Cebu alone. When I explained the rent increase, all 3 of them shook their heads. Lorna said, "You came all this way because of rent?" I said, "At first," and that was true. By then, I was beginning to realize money might have been the reason I arrived. But money probably wasn't going to be enough to make me stay. After that lunch, my week started changing. Lorna would message me sometimes and ask if I wanted coffee. Another woman, Grace, invited me to a family birthday. I started recognizing people around my neighborhood. The woman at the bakery knew which bread I usually bought. The security guard at my building started asking how my day was. None of these things were dramatic, but they mattered more than I expected. Cebu slowly stopped feeling like a place where I was testing my budget. It started feeling like somewhere I actually lived. Then, halfway through my 6-month experiment, something happened that tested the part of the plan I had been trying not to think about. I got sick. It started with a pain in my side. At first I ignored it. That was probably stupid. But whenever you're far from home, it's easy to convince yourself that something will go away because dealing with it feels complicated. By the second day, the pain was worse. I had a slight fever, too. That's when I got nervous. My daughter had asked me about health care before I left Florida. I told her I'd researched hospitals. I had insurance. I had money set aside. Everything sounded very organized when I explained it from my kitchen table in America. It felt different when I was actually sick. I messaged Lorna and asked where I should go. She called me almost immediately. 20 minutes later, she was downstairs. She took me to a private hospital. That alone made the whole situation less frightening. I didn't have to figure everything out by myself. The doctor thought I might have a urinary tract infection and ordered a few tests. I remember sitting there waiting for the results and thinking about the $10,000 I had set aside for this experiment. This was exactly the kind of expense that could ruin all my careful monthly budgeting. But the final bill was nowhere near what I expected. Between the consultation, test, and medication, I spent a little over $100. I know medical costs can be much higher depending on what happens. I wasn't fooling myself into thinking every health problem would be cheap. But that visit taught me something important. I could get care. I could understand what was happening. And most importantly, I wasn't completely alone anymore. A few days later, when I felt better, I called my daughter. I made the mistake of telling her I'd been sick after everything was already over. She was furious. "You went to a hospital and didn't tell me?" I told her I didn't want her worrying from the other side of the world. That answer did not help. Then she asked how much it cost. When I told her, she got quiet. Finally, she said, "That's it?" "That's it." There was another pause. Then she said something I hadn't expected from her. "Maybe I need to come see this place." That was a big change. 3 months earlier, she had been waiting for me to come home. Now she wanted to see why I wasn't leaving. We started talking about her visiting near the end of my 6 months. But before that happened, I had another decision to make. My storage unit in Florida was going up in price. My car insurance renewal was coming. I was paying money every month to keep pieces of my old life waiting for me. Storage, insurance, registration, things I wasn't using. Altogether, it was costing several $100s a month. And suddenly I saw the problem. I had reduced my expenses in the Philippines, but I was still paying to maintain an escape route in America. If I really wanted to know whether this life worked, eventually I had to decide whether I was just visiting or whether I was actually starting over. For a few days, I didn't do anything. I kept paying for everything back home. The storage unit, the car insurance, the little expenses that came with keeping one foot in America. It made me feel safer. If I changed my mind, I could go back. My car would be there. My furniture would be there. My boxes would be there. Nothing was permanent. But that safety was costing me almost $500 a month. That was more than my rent in Cebu. Once I saw it that way, it started bothering me. I called my daughter. "I think I'm going to sell the car." She didn't say anything at first. Then she asked, "Does that mean you're staying?" "I don't know." "Mom, you don't sell your car if you're coming home next month." She had a point. The car was 7 years old and paid off. I wasn't emotionally attached to it, but selling it felt bigger than selling a car. It felt like closing a door. My daughter helped me list it. A week later, someone bought it. After that, I called the storage company and asked about smaller units. I had furniture in there that wasn't worth paying to store for another year. A sofa, an old dresser, a kitchen table I'd already replaced once. Boxes of dishes I could buy again if I ever returned. So I made another decision. My daughter took what she wanted. A few things went to relatives. The rest was sold or donated. I kept one small storage unit. Family photos, documents, a few sentimental things. That was it. My monthly expenses back in America dropped from almost $500 to under $100. I expected to feel terrified. Instead, I felt relieved. For years, I had accumulated things because that was what you did. You bought furniture. You filled closets. You stored things you hadn't touched in a decade because you might need them someday. Now most of it was gone, and somehow my life felt easier. By month 4, my routine in Cebu had become pretty normal. I wasn't treating every day like a vacation anymore. Some mornings I stayed home. Some afternoons I met Lorna for coffee. I had a place I liked for grilled chicken. I knew where to get my hair cut. I knew which grocery store had the things I actually used. My spending that month came to around $1,500, still comfortably below my Social Security income. And because I had sold the car and reduced my storage costs, I was no longer losing hundreds of dollars in America either. For the first time in years, money stopped feeling like something chasing me. Then my daughter booked her flight. She was coming to Cebu for 10 days. I was excited, but I was also nervous, because I knew what she was really coming to see. Not the beaches, not the malls, not the food. She wanted to know if her mother had lost her mind. When my daughter walked out of the airport, she looked exhausted. Then she saw me and hugged me so hard I almost lost my balance. The first thing she said was, "You look good." I laughed. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. I was worried." I took her back to my apartment. I had warned her it was small. She walked through the whole place in about 30 seconds. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room. Then she looked at me. "This is really $430? "About that." She opened the refrigerator. She checked the air conditioner. She looked out the window. I could tell she was searching for the catch. That first night, we went out to dinner. Nothing expensive, just a restaurant I liked near my neighborhood. We both ate, had drinks, and shared dessert. When the bill came, she grabbed it before I could. Then she stared at the total. "That's for both of us?" I nodded. She started laughing. Over the next few days, I showed her my normal life. Not tourist Cebu, my Cebu. The bakery where I bought bread, the grocery store, the cafe where I met Lorna, the little restaurant where the staff already knew what I usually ordered. She met my friends. She saw me get around without needing someone to hold my hand. And slowly, I could see her relaxing. One afternoon, we were sitting in a coffee shop when she said, "I pictured this completely differently." "How?" "I thought you were basically hiding in some cheap apartment because you couldn't afford America." That hurt a little, but I understood why she thought it. From the outside, that's probably what my decision looked like. I couldn't afford the lifestyle I had in Florida, so I left. That part was true. But what she hadn't understood was that I didn't feel poor in Cebu. I wasn't constantly checking my bank account. I wasn't saying no to lunch because rent was due. I wasn't watching my savings shrink every month. I had less stuff, a smaller home, no car. but I had more breathing room. My daughter stayed quiet for a while. Then she said, "I get it now." Those 4 words meant more to me than I expected. Near the end of her trip, she asked what I was going to do when my 6 months were over. At that point, I had about 5 weeks left. I still hadn't made the final decision. I liked my life. The money worked. I had friends. But staying permanently meant accepting something I hadn't fully faced yet. My daughter would be far away. Future birthdays, holidays, family emergencies. There was no cheap apartment that could make that part easy. So during my final month, I stopped worrying about the budget. I already knew the financial answer. I could afford to live there. The real question was whether the life I gained was worth the distance from the life I left. My daughter flew home on a Tuesday. That night, the apartment felt unusually quiet. For 10 days, I'd had someone to eat with, talk with, and complain to. Then suddenly, it was just me again. I wondered if that feeling was a warning. Maybe I had been enjoying Cebu because everything was still new. Maybe 6 months wasn't enough time to know whether I could build a real life there. So I gave myself one final test. For the last month, I stopped treating the Philippines like an experiment. I stopped asking myself what something would cost back in Florida. I stopped checking flight prices home. I stopped counting the days left on my 6-month plan. I just lived. And something strange happened. Nothing happened. There was no dramatic moment where I suddenly knew Cebu was home. There was no perfect sunset where I made some big decision. Life just became normal. I paid my electric bill. I bought groceries. I got caught in the rain without an umbrella. I met Lorna for lunch. I spent an afternoon looking for a replacement phone charger. One evening, the power went out for a while, and I sat near the window because the apartment was getting warm. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't paradise. It was just life. And I think that's when I finally understood what I was looking for. I didn't need every day to be exciting. I needed my retirement to be sustainable. Financially, yes, but also emotionally. I needed people around me. I needed routines. I needed somewhere I felt comfortable waking up every morning. By the middle of that last month, I had another decision to make. My landlord asked if I wanted to extend the apartment. I could renew for 6 months. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I opened my spreadsheet and looked at the entire experiment. Over almost 6 months, I had spent less than I expected. The first month was expensive. After that, most months were between about $1,400 and $1,600. Some were a little higher. Some were lower. My Social Security had covered my normal living expenses, and the $10,000 I had set aside for the experiment was nowhere near gone. Back in Florida, I had been considering a part-time job just to keep my savings from disappearing. Here, I wasn't working at all, and my savings were basically holding steady. The numbers couldn't make the decision for me, but they removed the biggest reason I would have had to leave. So I called my daughter. "I think I'm staying." This time, she didn't argue. She just asked, "For how long?" I looked around the apartment. "I don't know." Then she laughed. "That's probably the first sensible thing you've said during this whole adventure." She was right. I didn't need to decide where I would spend the rest of my life. I only needed to decide what came next. So I renewed the apartment for 6 more months. And for the first time since arriving, I didn't have a return date. About 2 weeks after I renewed the apartment, I got an email from a medical office in Florida. It was one of the places I'd contacted before leaving. Months earlier, I had started an application for a part-time billing position. Apparently, they had kept my information. They wanted to know if I was still interested. 25 hours a week, Monday through Friday. The pay wasn't bad. If that email had arrived 6 months earlier, I probably would have accepted the job. I stared at it for a long time. There was nothing wrong with working at 69. Plenty of people do it because they enjoy working. Some want the routine. Some want extra money. But that wasn't why I had been looking for a job. I was looking because I was scared. Scared of my rent, scared of spending my savings, scared that retirement was something I could no longer afford. I typed a short reply thanking them for contacting me. Then I declined. After I sent it, I closed the laptop and walked to the bakery. The same bakery I'd visited during my first morning in Cebu. The woman behind the counter recognized me. The usual? I smiled. Yes. I sat outside with coffee and breakfast and thought about the woman who had landed in Cebu 6 months earlier. She had been exhausted, frightened, and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. She thought the entire experiment was about money. Could she live on $2,075 a month? That had been the question. Now I knew the answer. Yes. At least with the kind of life I was comfortable living, I could. But there were things I had learned that no spreadsheet could show. Living overseas didn't magically make every problem disappear. I still missed my daughter. There were days when I wanted American food. There were moments when not understanding something frustrated me. The heat could be exhausting. Traffic could drive me crazy. And I knew that if I ever had a serious medical problem, I might have decisions to make that were much bigger than the bill from one hospital visit. I wasn't pretending I'd discovered some perfect retirement paradise. What I had discovered was an option. Back in Florida, I felt trapped between two choices: spend my savings until they were gone, or go back to work. I hadn't realized there could be a third choice: change the place where I was trying to retire. That's what the Philippines gave me. Not a perfect life. A life that fit the money I actually had. And maybe more importantly, it gave me something I hadn't felt when I was staring at that $2,800 rent notice. Time. Time to enjoy retirement instead of constantly worrying about how long I could afford it. I came to Cebu planning to stay 6 months. That deadline passed 3 weeks ago. I'm still here. And this morning, I walked past a sign advertising a 2-bedroom apartment nearby. For a moment, I actually stopped to look at it. Not because I'm leaving, because I'm thinking my daughter might want her own room the next time she visits. 6 months ago, I was planning my escape route back to America. Now I'm making room for family to come see me here. A few months after I decided to stay, something happened that surprised me. I stopped checking my spending every day. During those first 6 months, I had recorded almost everything. If I bought coffee, I wrote it down. If I took a grab, I wrote it down. If I spent $6 more than planned at the grocery store, I noticed. I needed those numbers because I was trying to prove something. Could I actually afford this? Once I knew the answer, I relaxed. I still had a budget. I wasn't suddenly throwing money around. But I wasn't thinking about money every hour either. That was new for me. In Florida, almost every decision had eventually become a financial decision. Could I meet Carol for lunch? How much was gas? Should I turn the air conditioner up another degree? Could I wait until next month to replace something? None of those things alone ruined my retirement. It was the constant pressure of all of them together. In Cebu, I wasn't rich, I want to make that clear. I wasn't living in a luxury condo with an ocean view. I wasn't eating at expensive restaurants every night. I wasn't traveling around Southeast Asia every month. I was simply living within my income. And that felt better than I expected. My daughter visited again about 7 months after her first trip. This time she stayed longer, and before she arrived, I moved. Not because I needed something bigger. My old apartment was perfectly fine for me. But I found a 2-bedroom place for around $560 a month. It had a little more space, better natural light, and a second bedroom. I kept thinking about that room. My daughter could use it. Maybe someday one of my grandchildren could come. So I took it. When my daughter arrived and saw the bedroom, she laughed. "You really did this for me?" "Partly." "What happens when I'm not here?" "I close the door." She rolled her eyes. That visit felt completely different from the first one. The first time she had inspected everything. This time she unpacked. She already knew where I bought groceries. She knew Lorna. She knew the restaurant near my building. She didn't treat Cebu like the place where her mother had disappeared. She treated it like somewhere I lived. One evening, we were sitting in my living room when she brought up something I hadn't thought about in months. "Do you remember that apartment in Florida?" Of course I did. The $2,800 apartment. The email that started all of this. She had looked it up online. The same floor plan was now listed for more than $3,000 a month. We both stared at the listing on her phone. Then she said, "You know you would have gone back to work." I knew. Maybe only part-time. Maybe I would have found somewhere cheaper eventually. But the direction my life was going had been obvious. Every year, a little more money going out. A little more savings disappearing. A little less freedom. Instead, I was sitting in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cebu that cost less than 1/5 of that Florida rent. My daughter put her phone down. Then she said something I'll probably remember forever. "I thought you were running away." I looked at her. "From what?" "From your life." She paused. "But I think you were trying to keep it." That was exactly it. I hadn't moved because I wanted a new identity. I hadn't moved because I hated America. I hadn't moved because I thought the Philippines was perfect. I moved because I wasn't ready for my retirement to end 2 years after it started. And somehow, the decision that scared me the most had given me back the one thing I thought I was losing: choice. It's been more than a year now since I opened that rent increase notice in Florida. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the increase had been smaller. Maybe $100 instead of $500. I probably would have complained, signed the renewal, and stayed another year. Then another increase would have come, and eventually I would have faced the same problem. I'm almost grateful that the number was so ridiculous. It forced me to stop pretending everything was fine. People sometimes ask if moving to the Philippines saved me money. Of course it did. That part is easy to explain. My rent dropped dramatically. I don't own a car anymore. I spend less on many everyday things. Most months, my Social Security covers my normal expenses without much trouble. But when people hear those numbers, they sometimes get the wrong idea. They think the goal should be to find the cheapest possible life. I don't agree. I've seen apartments here for less than mine. I've met people who spend much less every month. I've also met retirees who spend twice what I do. There isn't one magic number. If I had tried to live on $800 a month just because somebody online said it was possible, I probably wouldn't have lasted. I like air conditioning. I like having a comfortable apartment. I like going out for coffee. Sometimes I want a cheeseburger instead of rice and fish. And every once in a while, I take a grab because I don't feel like figuring out public transportation. I'm 70 now. I'm not interested in turning retirement into a contest to see how little money I can spend. The important thing is that my income fits my life. Back in Florida, it didn't. Here, it does. That difference changed almost everything. I still keep enough savings available that I could return to America if I needed to. I haven't burned every bridge. I don't think that would be smart. Life can change. Health can change. Family situations can change. Maybe someday I'll decide I want to live closer to my daughter again. If that happens, I'll deal with it then. But I no longer make decisions based on what might happen 10 years from now. I wasted enough time doing that. Last week, Lorna and I were having coffee when she reminded me of the first conversation we ever had. She said I looked terrified. I told her I probably was. Then she asked if I ever imagined I'd still be here. I didn't even have to think about it. No. When I arrived, I thought success meant making it through 6 months without spending the $10,000 I'd set aside. That seems funny to me now. The money mattered, but the real success was reaching a point where I stopped feeling like I was waiting to go home. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being the place I had escaped to. It became the place where I bought groceries, where my friends knew how I took my coffee, where my daughter had a bedroom waiting for her, where I knew the security guard's name, where people noticed if I hadn't been around for a few days. Just normal things. But normal things are what make a place feel like home. I came to the Philippines because my rent reached $2,800 a month. If that hadn't happened, I might still be in Florida. Maybe I'd be working 25 hours a week in a medical office. Maybe I'd still be watching my savings slowly disappear. I'll never know. What I do know is that at 69, I thought I had run out of options. I hadn't. I just hadn't considered all of them yet. I didn't need to earn more money. I didn't need to give up retirement. I needed to build a life that fit the money I already had. For me, that life happened to be in the Philippines. I came here for 6 months. Then I stayed another 6. Now I've stopped putting an end date on it, and I haven't filled out another job application since.